Good afternoon. My name is Markus Balkenhol. I am a postdoc at Meertens Institute, and today I'll be talking about Zwarte Piet, Black Pete. And I'll be basing my talk in particular on the work of my colleague John Helsloot, who has done more than 20 years of research into the Sinterklaasfeest, the Santa Claus celebration in the Netherlands. It is difficult to say with any certainty what the St. Nicholas celebration looked like in the past. The celebration has long been a family holiday and was celebrated in the intimate sphere of the home. It was part of everyday life, and therefore there are few reliable sources available to the historian of that tradition. Any history of the celebration therefore needs to be pieced together and relies heavily on interpretations of the already scarcely available sources. This does not mean, however, that nothing can be said, even historically. In this micro-presentation, I will try to argue that Zwarte Piet needs to be understood within the broader historical frames of reference to which Europeans understood themselves in relation to a world that was in no small measure made through European colonial expansion. With regards to medieval St. Nicholas celebrations, it is more or less certain that the tradition did not include a helper of any kind. This is indicated by, for instance, a painting of Jan Steen from around 1665. It depicts the morning after St. Nicholas's night, when the family gathers in the living room and the children discover and unwrap their presents. There is no trace of a helper, let alone a black one. Indeed, there is not even a trace of the saint himself. The painting indicates that in the 17th century, the feast was actually celebrated in the absence of the saint. In the 18th century, the saint seems to have appeared in person during the celebration, at least if the depictions we have of the celebrations are anything to go by. On an etching included in the St. Nicholas Almanac of the year 1780, we see the saint distributing presents to the children. He has not yet taken the clear outward appearance of a bishop that he has today. Neither does he have a helper. The saint is still alone. The same is true for an early 19th century etching by Simon Kraus, on which St. Nicholas is shown among the children giving out presents. In Kraus's vision, the saint now appears in person, entering the intimate space of the family's living room. He is not, however, depicted with an assistant. There are indications that servants played a role as early as the late 18th century, but we are certain that these servants did not become popularized on a grand scale before 1850. In that year, an Amsterdam-based teacher, Jan Schenkman, published a children's book entitled St. Nicholas and His Servant. In it, St. Nicholas is accompanied by a black servant called Zwarte Piet. At least in terms of appearance, this is more or less the exact same figure of Zwarte Piet that we know today. A black man in a servant's costume. The question is, of course, why did Schenkman introduce this figure into the St. Nicholas tradition? This is a complex question that has no single straightforward answer. Even the question of whether Schenkman was or wasn't depicting an actual slave is embedded in broader social and cultural contexts, including art history, social and political changes, race relations, and demography. In the following, I will try to sketch that bigger picture. That is the historical and art historical context in which Schenkman operated, and in which doubtedly has influenced his depiction of Zwarte Piet. Why did Schenkman reinvent the St. Nicholas tradition in the first place? Schenkman has left no written sources that could explain this motivation. It is likely, however, that he was influenced by an increasing embrace of a new pedagogy. Midway through the 19th century, fear and violence were increasingly seen as inappropriate means to discipline children. A new form of discipline emerged that put the emphasis on milder forms of upbringing that took into account the children's psychological welfare. In this changing climate, a scaremongering saint was no longer acceptable. Zwarte Piet can be seen as Schenkman's attempt to address these concerns, and even to save the celebration from extinction. Schenkman thus imagined a comical and friendly character that was accessible to children. So, where did he get this idea from? Schenkman lived in Amsterdam, and he likely took notice of the black sailors who were part of many ships' crews. It is possible that his idea of black people arriving on a steamboat was inspired by his view of the harbour, thus locating the image of Zwarte Piet within global trading markets. These images of black people, however, were not neutral, and black people were typically depicted as subservient to whites. Hence, another source of inspiration may be the black domestic servants that were not uncommon in the 19th century Netherlands. These servants, although not always enslaved, nevertheless figured in an inferior position with regards to their white masters or employers. The racial hierarchy that structured social relations in the 19th century has a corollary in the visual arts. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the black servant had become a motif in European painting. Paintings were often status symbols, and the display of black servants on these paintings could enhance that status, even though the family did not actually have their own servants necessarily. When Schenkman wrote his book, the motif of the black servant had become less popular, but it is hard to imagine that Schenkman was not familiar with that motif. Even though it was no longer in fashion in the visual arts, the images this 17th and 18th century fashion had produced remained in musea, private collections and homes. That Schenkman was influenced by this earlier period in the European visual arts is also suggested by a painting by Michiel van Musser, dating from 1687. This painting bears a striking resemblance to one of the illustrations in Schenkman's book. In other words, the figure of Zwarte Piet must be seen in a broader system of European articulations of self and other. It is part and parcel of the particular modes of world-making that were dominant in the 19th century. The world that Europeans made during that period was a fundamentally hierarchical one, and depictions of racialized selves and others, such as Schenkman's, indicate that these hierarchies were seen as naturally given. In a world where Africa figured as a naturally inferior other, the dark continent without history or future, the depiction of a black person in the role of a servant must have seemed no less than logical. Indeed, it may suggest a treatment of a black person that was even progressive. Schenkman created Zwarte Piet in 1850, 23 years before slavery in the Dutch colonies was ended in practice in 1873. His creation, therefore, cannot be seen in isolation from a dominant worldview that made the enslavement of Africans seem acceptable to the majority of Europeans. But there could also be a more direct link with slavery. There are some indications that Schenkman was influenced by abolitionist literature and images, such as a short story by Jan de Liefde, in which an old man resembling St. Nicholas spoke out against slavery. The fact that this abolitionist also had a black servant shows that in Schenkman's time one could be against slavery without articulating a more encompassing critique of racial hierarchy. In other words, it is possible that one of the reasons Schenkman introduced Zwarte Piet was not to mock black people, but to provide a more progressive image of a black person that was no longer terrifying. In conclusion, it is impossible to understand Schenkman's creation of Zwarte Piet in isolation of the ways Europeans understood the world in the mid-19th century. This was a world in which racial hierarchies were seen as natural, and this was the case both in scientific and in theological discourse. Hence it is possible that Schenkman introduced Zwarte Piet not with the intention to mock black people, Indeed, it is possible that he might have even operated within a progressive frame of reference. This does not, however, mean that he did not create a racial stereotype. Thank you.